Today I want to share with you 5 more essential medicinal herbs to grow from making home remedies as I continue my series on herbs. Hi sweet friends, I'm Mary and welcome to Mary's Nest, where I teach traditional cooking skills for making nutrient-dense foods like bone broth, ferment, sourdough, and more. So if you enjoy learning about those things, consider subscribing to my channel and don't forget to click on the little notification bell below. That'll let you know every time I upload a new video. Well, in my previous video, I shared with you 10 essential medicinal herbs that you can grow to make home remedies. And it was such a popular video, I received a lot of comments and emails about the medicinal herbs you like to grow, as well as requests from me for additional herbs that I also like to grow. So today I wanted to share with you 5 more medicinal herbs that I like for their medicinal properties. And at the end, I have a few more bonus herbs that I want to share with you that many of you recommended to me. Now, I just want to mention that if you open the description below underneath this video, I'll have timestamps that correspond with each one of these herbs that I'm going to talk about, as well as the bonus herbs. And to open the description, all you need to do is click on the word Show More or the little down arrow that's to the right of the title of this video. Now, the first herb that I want to talk about is basil. It's a great herb, and it has both culinary and medicinal purposes. And specifically, the basil that I want to talk about is what's known as holy basil, or sometimes it's called Tulsi, T-U-L-S-I. Now, before I go into the details about holy basil, I just want to mention a word of caution when it comes to using herbs for their medicinal properties. As I've shared with you in the past, if you're pregnant, if you're nursing, if you're thinking of using herbs with children, if you take medication, either over-the-counter or prescription, or you have allergies, you really want to do your research about herbs and talk to your healthcare practitioner to find out if they are appropriate for you. And specifically in the case of pregnant women, you generally want to avoid holy basil, and another one you want to avoid is sage. Now, we'll talk about sage in detail in a minute, but holy basil can cause the uterus to contract, so that's definitely something that you don't want to induce when you're pregnant. And secondly, with sage, it can also have an effect on the uterus. And if you're a nursing mother, it can cause your milk to dry up. So you can see how important it is to really understand these herbs and their medicinal properties so as to when it's best to avoid them. Now, can basil and sage be used in culinary amounts, which are small amounts, when you're pregnant or nursing? That's really a decision that you're going to have to make and talk to your healthcare practitioner about. But I will tell you that when I was a nursing mother, I avoided sage because the last thing I wanted to do was make anything difficult to build up my milk supply. Now, holy basil, like all basils, is an annual, and you can grow this from seed. Now, it does best specifically in zones 7 through 9. And in my previous video where I talked about the 10 essential medicinal herbs that I like to grow, I discuss what I mean by zones. And just for a quick overview, what I'm referring to is here in the United States, we have a system called hardiness zones. And that basically gives us an indication as to what plants will do best based on where we live, in the United States, based on our climate. Now, if you want to know what hardiness zone you're in, it's easy to search for this on the internet, or you can contact your local extension service, your agricultural extension service, which is usually associated with a large state university in your area. And if you live in other parts of the world, just contact your local agricultural office and hopefully they will be able to tell you, if not specific hardiness zones like we have here in the United States, but they'll be able to tell you what varieties of plants grow best in your area. Now, don't worry if you don't live in zones 7 through 10. You can still grow basil if you live in a cooler climate. You're just going to have a shorter window of time when it will grow because it does like it warm and it likes full sun. And when your holy basil flowers, it's best to collect the seeds because even though the seeds may fall down into your soil and self-seed and grow up in the following season, it may not do that if you live in a relatively cold climate. So best to always collect your seeds and then seed those in the early spring, sow them in the early spring to grow your basil in the summer. Now, what is holy basil good for? Well, it's called holy basil for a reason, because it really is one of those herbs that covers many areas. It's good for being used against colds and flus and earaches and fevers and all sorts of things like that. But what's especially interesting is that when turned into a wash, say you make a wash with this like a tea, and you use it topically, it can actually repel mosquitoes. And in addition to helping with the symptoms associated with colds and flus, holy basil also helps calm digestive upset. So a cup of tea made from holy basil can be very soothing if you have any type of stomach problem or digestive problem, like acid reflux and GERD and so on and so forth. Because holy basil is associated with so many medicinal properties, it's been extensively studied by scientists. And I'll have a corresponding blog post that goes along with this video over on my website, Mary's Nest, same name as my YouTube channel. And I'll be sure to put a link to that in the description underneath this video so that you can read more about these herbs in greater detail. And I'll put the links to the various scientific studies that show what healing properties they really do help with. And I want to mention, if you are looking for seeds to grow these herbs in your own kitchen garden, or you're not in a position to grow your own herbs and you want to buy them already dried, be sure to check out Mountain Rose Herbs. That's where I like to buy my seeds and my dried herbs from, and I've been buying from them for many years now. Everything they sell is organic and it's just terrific. And I contacted them and they were so kind to give me a discount code to pass on to you for 15% off anything on their website. And that coupon code is going to be good through the end of this month, March 2021. So if you're looking for seeds or dried herbs, be sure to head over there, and I'll put the link in the description below. And I just want you to know, this isn't a sponsored post. I buy all my seeds or my dried herbs from Mountain Rose because I just think so well of the company, and I've always been so pleased with their products. And speaking of growing herbs, I want to reassure you that even if you don't have a kitchen garden or a big full-fledged garden, you can still grow herbs. Herbs are relatively easy to grow. So even if you live in the city and maybe you just have a little balcony or a little patio or even a sunny kitchen windowsill or any sunny windowsill for that matter, you can grow a lot of these herbs in pots. So know that whether you're in the city, the suburbs, or the country, you can grow herbs. Next, I want to talk about Feverfew. Now, this herb, like holy basil, like sage, is generally not recommended to be used by pregnant women, so keep that in mind. And if you have an allergy to ragweed, Feverfew will probably cause allergic reactions in you as well, so you'll best want to avoid having it in your garden. Now, Feverfew best grows in zones 5 through 9, and it's a biennial perennial. And what I mean by biennial perennial means that it's going to grow for just 2 seasons. The first season, you're going to see the stems and the leaves, and then the next season, it's going to flower. And when it flowers, it'll go to seed, and then it will die. Now sometimes, and it kind of really depends what zone you're in and how warm it is and a couple of other variables, Feverfew may actually flower its first season as well as its second season. So after the first season, you can cut it back, and then in the spring, the following spring, it'll grow up again and it'll have beautiful flowers on it that look like little daisies. Now when you go to plant your Feverfew seeds, you really just want to put them on top of the soil. You want them to make contact with the soil, but you really don't want to get involved in pushing the seeds down and covering them with a lot of dirt, because in order for Feverfew seeds to germinate, they really need to see the sun. So just gently put them down in an area in your garden or in a pot, whatever way you want to plant them, and gently mist them with some water, and even like in a little handheld spray mister so that you don't disturb the seeds. And they should germinate relatively quickly. Maybe about 14 days you should start to see little sprouts. Now what is Feverfew good for? Well, as the name implies, fever, it is associated with helping to bring down one's fever when you do have a cold or flu. So a Feverfew tea can be very helpful if you are running a fever. But something that Feverfew is really known for is that it's wonderful at helping to alleviate headaches. And you may often see herbal tea remedies for headaches that include Feverfew and lavender, because lavender can be very calming and soothing, and then mixed with the Feverfew can be wonderful at helping to calm the nervous system and help increase circulation and relieve the headache. Now next I want to talk about rosemary. This is a wonderful herb, and what I've got here is some dry rosemary, and what I've got here is some fresh rosemary. Rosemary grows beautifully here in Central Texas, where I live in Zone 8B. Generally, rosemary grows best in zones 7 through 10 because you want to think of the Mediterranean climate. It likes it warm and breezy. It doesn't like it when it gets real cold and starts freezing, which I discovered during all of the Texas storms we had with the sub-zero temperatures and the ice and the snow. It killed all of my rosemary, along with a lot of other things in my garden. But I've started replanting rosemary because I love it and it does great here under normal circumstances. And I'm also completely redoing my kitchen garden. And if that's something that you'd like to join me with, because I'll be filming that, be sure to subscribe and click on the notification bell if you haven't already done so, because this is part of a series of videos that I'm doing on herbs, as well as how to make different preparations using the herbs we grow or buy. Plus, I want to share with you how I go about growing a lot of these in my garden. So if that's something that interests you, be sure to click on the notification bell so you'll know when those videos come out. Now, the best way to grow rosemary is from root cuttings, or you can certainly start with a little plant. But if you have a neighbor who grows rosemary and they can give you a little cutting, you can root it and then start growing it that way. Growing rosemary from seed can be a little challenging. And don't feel bad if you don't live in a climate where rosemary grows well outside naturally. You can certainly grow rosemary in pots during your warm months, and then you can bring it inside during your colder months. Because if you're familiar with Rosemary Gladstar, who writes a lot of books about herbs and is really considered an authority on herbs, she lives in Vermont and she's in zone 3, so it gets very cold. And she jokes in one of her books about how she's killed many a rosemary plant trying to grow rosemary in her zone. But now she'll grow it in pots and she'll simply bring it inside during the colder months, and she's a lot more successful in growing her rosemary. And speaking of rosemary, I just want to mention, while we're speaking of rosemary, if you are interested in learning more about medicinal herbs and you're a beginner, and even if you're not a beginner, as you can see, my book is well loved here. But Rosemary has this wonderful book called Medicinal Herbs, A Beginner's Guide. And she talks about how to know it, or how to know the herb, how to recognize it, how to grow it, and how to use it. And I highly recommend her book. Check for this at your local library. That's something that I want to mention. If you are new to herbs or new to gardening, whether it's herb gardening or fruit and vegetable gardening, whatever the case may be, always check with your library first and see what books they have. Check them out, start reading them, look through them, see what you like. If you can find this one, great, but any book by Rosemary is going to be terrific. And then you can think about what ones you might like to add to your library. And then I'll give you a little tip, your own personal library. And then I'll give you another little tip. Be sure to check used bookstores, because I think you will find there's a lot of gardening books, and a lot of them are herb gardening books. But I think a lot of people will start gardening and then maybe, they either lose interest or throw in the towel, which is too bad, because growing herbs is actually very easy. But be sure to check with your used bookstores first. And see what you can find. But I'll be sure to put a link to Rosemary's book below in the description. But she's a wonderful resource whenever it comes to learning about any type of herb. So what is rosemary good for when you think of it in terms of a medicinal herb as opposed to just a culinary herb? Rosemary is what's specifically known as a brain tonic. And the reason is because it's very stimulating. Scientists have found that it works to enhance the uptake of oxygen to the brain. And clearly, the more oxygen we have going into our brain, the more awake we are, the more stimulated we are. Scientists have also found that rosemary contains analgesic properties. So not only does it help to bring more oxygen to the brain, it brings an analgesic effect. So what does that mean? It means that it helps relieve headaches. So if you find yourself plagued with headaches, you may find that rosemary, in addition to feverfew, can be very helpful for you to have in your medicinal herbal medicine cabinet. Both work wonderful as teas and tinctures. And in an upcoming video, I'm going to be giving you master recipes for how to make herbal medicinal teas, as well as how to make herbal medicinal tinctures and more. And thanks to its analgesic properties, rosemary is a wonderful anti-inflammatory. And additional scientific research has found that it can actually help ease the pain associated with arthritis. So rosemary is just one of those all-around wonderful herbs to use both for culinary purposes as well as medicinal purposes. Next, I want to talk about sage. Now, when it comes to sage, there are so many varieties, more than I can count. I would say probably well in excess of 700 varieties of sage. But today, what we want to talk about is simple garden sage. And I believe the Latin pronunciation for garden sage or common sage would be Salvia officinalis. So when you go to the nursery and you just see this barrage of sage, you'll know that you want to look for something that's going to be labeled common sage or common garden sage or the Salvia officinalis. Now you'll have the best luck in your garden if you buy little sage plants, or if you have a neighbor who's growing sage and can give you some root cuttings, and then you can root those and grow it that way. That's going to be the best bet to get sage growing nicely in your garden. And sage grows best in zones 4 through 8, and it really does like full sun. And it doesn't like a super moist or even a very humid environment. So as you get kind of down into zones 9 and 10, like maybe way down in South Texas, it can be a little hard to grow sage because it does like sort of the drier, hot, sunnier environment to do well. But once you get sage established in your garden, it is a perennial. So in the fall, you can just cut it back, and then in the spring, it'll grow back up again. Now, sage is often used in culinary purposes, and the reason is it's excellent for helping us digest fats, specifically the fat associated with fatty meats. So from a medicinal standpoint, a cup of sage tea, which has quite a strong, good, intense flavor, can really help you digest a meal where you've eaten a lot of fatty meats and you may be having some trouble digesting them. And the reason why we talked about earlier that sage is not something good to be used by pregnant women is because it does have mild hormonal effects which can affect the uterus. But that can work to the benefit of women who are not pregnant and are still menstruating but are having trouble with their menstrual cycle. That sage tea or sage tinctures have been found helpful to regulate the menstrual cycle. Sage is also helpful if you're fighting a cold or a flu. You'll often see some sage included in home remedies relating to teas or garlics or sprays for a sore throat, different things like that. So it's really a very useful herb to have on hand, not only for culinary purposes when maybe making a meal with very fatty meats, but also as an herb to have on hand to help fight colds and flus. Now, I didn't exactly do these in alphabetical order because I saved Moringa for last, because technically this is not an herb, this is a tree, but this is something that's really well worth growing if you can grow it in your zone. Moringa is known as the tree of life or the miracle tree. And because so much is associated with Moringa, it has been studied extensively by scientists. So there's a lot that's known about Moringa. Now, Moringa is a tropical tree. So here in the United States, this is going to grow best in zones 8, 9, and 10. Basically in those of us who are in the southern and western states. Now, Moringa can grow very tall. This can grow 18, 20 feet if left to grow as a tree. But many gardeners will keep cutting it back to encourage it to grow more like a bush, a pretty large bush. And the reason that Moringa is called the tree of life or the miracle tree is because it offers so much food to those who grow it, and food that is very rich in vitamins and minerals. And in some developing countries, this is a wonderful source of nutrition for them. The leaves of the Moringa tree can be cut up and thrown into a salad. They can be used to make a tea or a tincture, and they're very, very rich in vitamin C. Also, the Moringa tree grows these pods. They look sort of like string beans, and they can be eaten when they're in the fresh stage, just like you would eat string beans. And these pods can also be cracked open and contain little seeds, maybe, for lack of a better word, but that are similar to like peas, and they can also be eaten. But because of the extensive studies done on Moringa, scientists have found that it really can help with so many different types of ailments. And in the corresponding blog post with this video, I'll link to a lot of different studies where scientists are studying Moringa's effects on cancer, on bone density, on various inflammatory type conditions. So there's a lot that they're looking at and seeing how Moringa may be able to help. And there's even some research being done on how Moringa may be able to protect the liver when people are receiving medical treatment that could be very hard on their liver. And that Moringa, similar to the herb milk thistle, that can be very protective of the liver, that scientists are studying that maybe Moringa could be very helpful as well. And even more interesting is that studies are being done on the effects of Moringa on various mental disorders. So you really can see why they call it the tree of life. It's all-encompassing, and it seems to have an overall healing effect on our whole bodies. both our physical and our mental well-being. So it's definitely worth something growing in your garden if you live in a hot enough climate. And if not, it's something that's definitely worth keeping on hand that you've purchased dry or even in tea bags, and that you start enjoying some moringa tea. And although you always want to check with your healthcare professional whenever you start introducing any type of herb or herbal preparation into your diet or into your health care, overall, moringa is one of the herbs that is considered to be relatively safe. But definitely do your research, read up on moringa, talk to your healthcare professional, and see if adding it into your diet is a good idea. Now, I promised you a couple of bonus herbs, and these two herbs were recommended by some of you, and so I want to share this with the whole audience. The first is an herb called mullein. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. I think the spelling should come across the screen, but I believe it's pronounced mullein. And this is one of those biennial perennials. So the first year it may grow up and be stems and leaves, and then the second season it should get a nice big, I believe it's a yellow flower. And I've learned that when you grow this, don't rush to cut it back in its second season when those sort of stalky yellow flowers come up, because apparently bugs love to nest in there, and then the birds like to come and feast on the bugs that are nesting in there. And so it's a wonderful cycle of life. And apparently mullein is very easy to grow. It can grow in climates as cold as zone 3 and as hot as zone 8. Now, why would you want to grow mullein? Well, there's two really good reasons. One is that it's a natural expectorant. So if you make a tea or a tincture with mullein, it can help you bring up phlegm if you've got a real bad cold or chest congestion. But the second reason is that it also is very soothing to the bronchial passages. So not only is it going to help you bring up that phlegm, it's also going to soothe your irritated bronchial passages when you have that severe chest congestion. And the next herb that I want to share with you is called plantain. And you would probably recognize this. When I looked this up, I realized I have seen this grow in my garden, and I simply thought it was a weed. When you research plantain, you're going to laugh, because you will read a lot of gardeners say, take a patch of soil in your garden, scratch it up a little, make sure it's in the sun, water it a little every now and again, and plantain will come and visit you. And why would you want to grow plantain in your garden or encourage it, even though it sort of looks like a weed? Is because it's wonderful for digestive disorders. If you suffer from acid reflux, or the more advanced version of it that they refer to as GERD, whatever the case may be, if you have digestive upsets like that, plantain can tamp it down very quickly. And I'm going to put a link to a video. I'll put it in the pinned comment below, to my friend's channel. Her name is Jackie, and she has a channel called Little Country Cabin. And she has a whole video just where she talks about plantain and how it really helped her overcome some very severe GERD symptoms that she had. But plantain has another very helpful use as well. You can make it into a wash or a poultice, and you can put it on a bee sting or a bug bite, something like that, and it can help soothe it very quickly. Plantain also has styptic properties, which means that it can stop bleeding. So if you're working in the garden and you get a little cut and it's bleeding, nothing major or serious that would require stitches, but just a little simple cut or a nick. These types of things happen so often in the garden. And if you're growing plantain, you can take some of the plantain leaves and put it onto your cut, and it should quickly stop the bleeding. And although plantain, the actual leaf, can have a little bit of a bitter flavor, it's really rich in vitamins and minerals, and you can chop it up and add a little bit into a salad. Now, if you'd like to see the first video in this series where I go over 10 other medicinal herbs you can grow for making home remedies, be sure to click on this video over here, where I have a playlist that not only covers that first video, but also other videos where I show you how to use some of those herbs to make home remedies. And I'll see you over there in my Texas Hill Country kitchen. Love and God bless.